Hey, Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, Julie K. Brown is the reporter whose 2018 investigation into Jeffrey Epstein blew the lid off the scandal, leading to the pedophile's 2019 indictment. We know that because it's what prosecutors cited when asked why they pursued that indictment. It's an incredible series and a remarkable piece of journalism, litigating sensitive and explosive and difficult allegations while also contextualizing them, importantly, within Epstein's social and political power structure. Brown's book, Perversion of Justice, debuts today. In an interview with the New York Times published Monday, the celebrated reporter shared some reflections that actually should leave us all terrified. In 2017, where the book begins, Brown was a veteran reporter hoping to transition from the Miami Herald to the Washington Post, looking for stability amid a climate of turnover and layoffs not uncommon to local news outlets these days. She did not get that job. But while keeping her fingers crossed for the good news, Brown returned to the Epstein case, spurred by Donald Trump's nomination of Alexander Acosta to head up the Labor Department. In late November of 2018, Brown published a story with the headline, "How a Future Trump Cabinet Member Gave a Serial Sex Abuser the Deal of a Lifetime," detailing Acosta's almost inexplicable decision to offer him a non-prosecution agreement that, quote, essentially shut down an ongoing FBI probe into whether there were more victims and other powerful people who took part in Epstein's sex crimes, Brown wrote. His sentence was 13 months in a county jail. Now, Brown's style is not something that used to be described as a style. It's just fact-based reporting conveyed with good writing that avoids sensationalism and injections of the first person. It trusts the reader as much as the reporter. It sells the story with facts and narrative, but not with hyperbole. Make no mistake, that kind of journalism helped in some part the story be taken seriously by the public and by the prosecutors who cited it. 4 of Epstein's abusers went on the record with Brown, who'd taken a pay cut, by the way, in 2009, and remembers that she quote, consoled myself by remembering that I still had my waitressing chops from my early years in journalism in case I needed them. The Herald, Brown says, wasn't, quote, excited 100%, but I think they trusted that it was worth letting me pick away at it and see what I would come up with. She covered some of her own expenses while reporting that story out. Brown is hardly the only journalist to probe the Epstein allegations, but her diligence is a really central piece of this story. National reporters who spend their days squawking on Twitter think of themselves as firefighters as they dunk on podcasters and aggregate other people's scoops. They are not the protagonists in our national drama right now, no matter what they think. Meanwhile, outside of their bubbles, more than 200 of the nation's 3,143 counties have no local newspaper, according to a recent study from UNC's journalism school. Half, just over 1,500 counties, have only one newspaper, the report found. 2/3 no longer even have a daily newspaper. Digital news sites have failed to fill the void, leaving residents to turn to social media or regional television stations in distant cities for news, that study noted. Unsurprisingly, the UNC researchers also found that, quote, residents in communities that have lost a newspaper tend to be poorer, older, and less educated than the average American, and, quote, 18% live in poverty, compared with a national average of 12%. Now, this is particularly relevant to the Epstein case study because he deliberately preyed on girls from lower socioeconomic backgrounds than your average Palm Beach neighbor. Those women need voices. This is not about markets gobbling up inefficient artifacts of a bygone era to better serve consumers. This is the diminishment of local watchdogs that disincentivize and expose corruption, whose costs are coming at the benefit of reckless multinational corporate superpowers. Let's not gloss over big tech's role. Quote, most Americans access their news through Facebook and Google, 2 tech giants that effectively control the online news market and the information we see every day through duopoly. That's from Republican Congressman Burgess Owens. He wrote that back in April and continued, news publishers are forced to play by their rules, making it nearly impossible to collaborate to negotiate fair policies and free practices with these online platforms without running afoul of antitrust laws. Plus, the local ecosystem provided a pipeline to national media as members of an affected community reported on that community, and then national reporters would use their context to bring stories to a bigger audience with more accuracy and nuance. It also brings more reporters with local backgrounds into national media rather than kids like myself who skipped that step, save for my summer internship at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. It's amazing how much more effective an op-ed placed in a relevant local paper is than one in a national outlet. They're so much more impactful. Again, local journalists are government and business watchdogs. Less of them means more room for corruption. It means more of us will be in the dark about our own communities and about communities around the country. It's the difference between a Julie K. Brown series and Jeffrey Epstein back on the streets. Brown was there this time. What's disturbing is to think of all the stories going untold right now and in the future because localities are without robust news outlets. Thanks to tech platforms eating up their ad dollars and promoting half-assed sensational national aggregations. Communities are fragile ecosystems. In republics like ours, the press is an important part of these ecosystems. And remember, as communities are hollowed out by outsourcing and private equity, and you have these communities that are suffering in the shadows of our major cities, they are incredibly vulnerable to predatory behavior by our government and by our business communities. And you know what, that was displayed fully throughout the opioid crisis. We have seen it very clearly. While our national media is hopelessly corrupt, our local papers are withering and leaving huge blind spots that will be exploited by the powerful. And we know that people in vulnerable situations are already their easiest prey. If democracy dies in darkness, Jeff Bezos should be freaking out. Something tells me he isn't. They'll cover his little trip to space much more than what happened in Bessemer and much more than what happens in places like Bessemer every single day. So, Ryan, one thing that I think is important is what Burgess Owens was talking about in terms of the big tech angle and the way that some of these tech platforms have gobbled up the ad revenues that local papers absolutely relied on to just be stable. And it's not that, I mean, even when we talk about the statistics from UNC that some of these papers have closed, a lot of them are still open. They're just anemic. And that a lot of that comes from Google and Facebook, who have sort of, made overtures and said they want to help save local news. So they've written some hefty checks, but at the end of the day, it's about the model, isn't it?
Yeah, Google and Facebook came in and kind of picked at the carcass.
Yeah.
And local news was taking hit after hit after hit. The first really was Craigslist, which took the classified business away from local newspapers. Classifieds were an incredible source of revenue for newspapers, and they were also a product. Like, people would pick up the newspaper for the classifieds. So in other words, people would pay to produce the content, and then other people would pay to get the content. Yeah. And the newspapers were just in the middle gobbling that up. That was a huge chunk. Then car dealerships and department stores made up massive parts of the advertising budget. These full-page ads for the dealers, or for the malls, and for the J.C. Penney's. In the 2000s and after the financial crisis, those things collapsed.
Yeah.
In the wake of the financial crisis, private equity comes in, buys them up, extracts all the value out of them.
Yep.
So then small businesses who used to advertise in the local paper now start advertising through Google and Facebook, basically. And so any ability for a local news outlet to be locally funded was just destroyed by this.
Yeah.
And so the question is what to do about it. And I think of things like Google and Facebook as public utilities at this point that should be regulated and required to basically fund local journalism. If they're the way that people are getting news, then they need to recreate those newsrooms that existed. Otherwise, like you said, you're going to get all of this collapse of community and corruption.
Yeah, it's stunning. So this is some of this is from Michelle Goldberg's interview with Julie K. Brown that was published yesterday, as I said. And Julie K. Brown is talking about, again, she took this pay cut, 15% pay cut in 2009. She just recently was able to actually buy a condo and stop renting. And I don't know, the context of the rest of the story there. And it's rare for me to think of journalists in this sort of like victim sense. But on the local front, I mean, this is, again, the difference between Epstein roaming the streets of Palm Beach
Yeah.
and Epstein, facing the justice system.
Right.
And it really is the difference. And there's a lot of important national reporting that happens every single day. But I think like the opioid crisis is a great example of any, because the anemic nature of so many of our local news. It's not like, also, by the way, we haven't even talked about how they foster a sense of community and how they facilitate community. But on top of that, I mean, I think the sort of people in the Beltway were gobsmacked by the severity of the opioid crisis, in part because they hadn't had, the pipeline had been so diminished.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And without Julie Brown, like you said, there may never have been the prosecutions that we know of. And in the future, with fewer Julie Browns, more people are going to get away with horrific crimes.
100%. Well, as Ryan said, the question then becomes what to do about it. Coming up, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp and Robbie Suave join us for Team Rising. Stick with us for that.